Speaker today is Nancy Caruso. So before she gets started, I'm going to give a little bit of background on her. So Nancy is a Virginia native with a BS in marine biology with an emphasis in aquaculture and chemistry. Early in her career, Nancy worked in the aquaculture industry and for a local public aquarium. Wanting to do more conservation work within her community, Nancy left the aquarium to build a program to restore Orange County, California's decimated kelp forests. With help from magazine, newspaper articles, as well as a television and radio, Nancy has helped to bring the message of the importance of kelp forests along our coast to millions. The Orange County Ocean Restoration Project has taught 5,000 students how to grow giant kelp in their classrooms. That was planted in the ocean by 250 trained volunteers, and now there are giant kelp forests in areas that have been barren for more than 25 years. To continue her work, Nancy started a nonprofit organization called Get Inspired. She continues to restore the kelp forest ecosystem and has taught 5,000 more students to grow white sea bass in their classrooms, which are released annually to their ocean habitats in the restored kelp forests. Get Inspired is dedicated to inspiring stewardship and curiosity for the natural world through the exploration of science. Nancy has just begun a massive 10-year project to restore green abalone with the help of the public aquaria, museums, and 36,000 Southern California students in their classrooms. This project will educate millions of people about how, in one human lifetime, we nearly ate the abalone to extinction and how we can all work together to bring them back. So Nancy's nonprofit, Get Inspired, is very accurately named, as she has inspired hundreds of local students to pursue an education in marine science, including myself. In fact, Nancy is affectionately known by many in Southern California as the Kelp Lady. Without further ado, Nancy, take it away.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Nancy. Hey, Nancy, can you hear us? You're going to need to start over. We can't hear you. Hold on.
How about that? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great. So thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody else for having me today. This is the first, remote seminar, and I'm glad to be the first one to try it so that you guys can talk to people all over the world instead of having the constrictions of having them show up for the seminar. So hopefully you'll get to hear from fantastic folks around the globe that are doing amazing things to help get you inspired as you head off into the world here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start my talk, and I will take questions at the end. So I guess if you have any, just hold on to them, and I'll probably be about 35 minutes or so, 40 minutes. But basically today I'm going to tell you about the community-based ocean restoration projects that I've been working on for the last 15 years. And when I started working on community-based projects, they were kind of a new thing. I was going to seminars and to conferences and presenting data that was being collected by my students and by my volunteers, and it wasn't widely accepted to show those data and for people to take them as real and understand them. And now it's pretty commonplace to go to a conference and see volunteer collected data from all range of projects, from physics all the way to, of course, ecology and environmental science. So this is nothing new now, but it was kind of a new thing when this all got started. All right. So the organization that I started in 2009 is called Get Inspired. And just a little bit of background for you guys, because you're all heading out into the real world probably soon, and you're going to be looking for jobs. But as you know, a lot of science is based on funding. And I actually started doing restoration projects for an organization who dropped the project before it was done. And nothing was more heartbreaking to me than starting a project to restore kelp forests that had been gone in Southern California and then have that organization just end the project. I wasn't done yet. And I know that's a problem for a lot of scientists around the world where you start a project, you get really deep into it, and then the funding's gone. Luckily for me, I'm really tenacious and pig-headed, unlucky for my husband. But I got to move that project to a couple other organizations because I got laid off twice more because of funding issues. So I'd take the little money that I had, move to another organization, and start up the project again, so to speak, keeping it going. And I was so inspired by the volunteers who had helped me throughout those years keep the project going that when it came time for me, the third time I got laid off because of project funding, I thought I was going to name this organization Get Inspired, because I was so touched myself, inspired myself by the hundreds of people who were dedicated to making a change in the world because they believed that it was possible. And a lot of people in the world right now want to know that that's possible. They want to do something, not talk about it, not just give money to something, but they want to do something. So that is why I named the organization so. Our mission is to inspire stewardship and curiosity for the natural world through the exploration of science. And based on the project that I started the organization with, which was the Kelp Restoration Project, it's based on involvement and engagement. So actually getting a chance to do something. That's what I found really motivates people, obviously, when they get a chance to see results. So our programs include aquaponics. My training is, my degree is in marine biology, but I also actually worked on a second bachelor's degree at the same time. And I don't have it because I was short one class. And if I had to ask you to guess which class that was that I couldn't take to get my second bachelor's degree, yes, it's algal aquaculture. So I ended up working in kelp forest restoration, growing algae for 15 years, and I lack the algal aquaculture class that would have given me a second degree in aquaculture in college. So I started up a program called aquaponics, as a lot of people love doing aquaculture, and I found that teachers really like aquaponics for the classrooms. Science Expeditions is another program, and the third program is the Orange County Ocean Restoration Project, which is the focus of my talk today. So just in short, if you don't know what aquaponics is, this is aquaponics. So this is the land exhibit at Epcot Center in Disney World. This was my first job out of college, and I immediately went to aquaculture. And essentially, I grew fish for the Disney World hotels and restaurants. And it's also an exhibit. So there's a ride that goes through there that the guests of Disney World get to see. But I got to work there and learned all about harvesting food from water and growing plants and fish together. So I teach this all over Southern California. It's great for teaching, of course, engineering, which is a big part of aquaculture, but also plant, fish biology, as well as cycles. And students really are kind of separated from their food, unfortunately, now. Most of the students I've taught how to grow food have refused to eat it at first glance because it didn't come from a plastic bag. So it's really nice to see people reconnecting with their food, especially here in Southern California. We don't have much open green space. So most people don't have farms nearby that they can get fresh produce from. And these are just some photos of kids. About 19 different schools right now are doing this program, and several of them grow enough food to feed their entire school. So these are just a few of those schools that have I've been able to work with in engineering systems and then growing food for their schools. The Science Expeditions program is one actually that Elizabeth was involved in. So I got involved in teaching environment AP classes, essentially the lab sections of AP classes, because teachers had a hard time teaching field work. They weren't really adept at teaching data collection in high schools. So I took on teaching AP environmental science classes, and then that spurred off into all kinds of other programs for students as well. So I do basically like a field study class, a college level field study class, but with high school students. And for kids that are really interested in science, I kind of hold them to a higher standard, and they get a lot out of it. Obviously, Elizabeth is now still studying kelp. So this is a marine science camp. I also do that in the summertime for really serious students who are interested in going into college to study ocean sciences. And I'm also a naturalist, so I take people all over the country into Alaska. I've been a naturalist up there in the summer times for about 6 years, guiding tours and trips and vacations. And if you're going into marine biology, you're probably already aware you're going to have 3 or 4 jobs. So you get them where you can. This is a trip that I also do with adults, taking them down to swim with whale sharks in Baja, and then of course we go down to hug the gray whales in February every year. Do about a group of 10 twice a year down to Baja. Okay, and now on to ocean restoration projects. So these, again, came out of a project that I was working on under another organization, got laid off 3 times, and decided to keep the projects going, but under my own umbrella of Get Inspired. And the premise of this project, it was actually a NOAA-funded restoration project in the very beginning. They still fund restoration. They have a NOAA Restoration Center, and they're kind of committed to habitat restoration. And I love the premise that the project was created under. Their restoration center isn't always necessarily with community-based projects, but this one was. And when I took on the project, I knew it would be difficult because I knew I had to get a lot of people involved. I had to make a lot of people love kelp. And if you just walk into a grocery store and ask everybody in the grocery store how many people love algae, it's not a common thing. Usually you get comments as if it's slimy and, oh, it's the stuff that has flies on it. People don't really love algae. So I had a big job ahead of me because people only protect what they love, and they only love what they understand. And that's where we're trying to push people to love sharks right now. So everybody will want to protect sharks. But it is a natural human instinct to only want to protect things that we love. And of course, we have to understand them first. So this community-based effort was put in place by the NOAA Restoration Center, and I've just continued it through all the projects that I work on. It's actually quite beautiful because generally the humans are the reason why we have to do the restoration in the first place. So if we don't involve the humans in the restoration, you'll probably end up where we were when we started. So it's good to have the community involved in fixing what we probably broke in the first place. So the things I'm working on restoring, the giant kelp forests, it was just the giant kelp, but now I'm working on the whole ecosystem. And most recently, you're probably aware, being up there, the bull kelp forests of Northern California. I'll get to that in just a second. But essentially, 2 years ago, I was jumping up and down, screaming at the people in Northern California because they weren't doing anything to fix the restoration needed up there. And so I started the project to restore the Northern California kelp forest as well, after watching the movie Chasing Coral. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it. But there's a line in the movie where Dr. Charlie Varon, who's the godfather of coral reef ecology, he says, "I didn't do enough. I should have done more." And I looked at my husband when he said that in the movie, and I started crying. I said, okay, nobody's doing anything. I know what needs to be done. I'm going to start the project. So I raised the first funds to start paying those urchin fishermen up there to get to work. And that spawned the big project that's being done right now. So I'll get more back to that. But the white sea bass program, I am also doing restoration of sea bass, and then the green abalone, as was mentioned. So going to the giant kelp project, I'm essentially going to tell you how this all played out, because I think this is the way that the future, not just of restoration, but of habitat maintenance for the future. I think we're all going to have to be responsible for our local habitats, wherever they are, and it's going to take the community. It's going to take money. It's going to take monitoring and effort to maintain it. Specifically for me, my vision, my goal always is biodiversity. And if we're not keeping an eye on biodiversity, we're screwed. So I think this was a project to restore something, but I think it's going to have to be the way we live, is monitoring everything as a community and maintaining things as a community. When things get out of whack, then we put the restoration in progress. 5,000 kids were involved in growing kelp in their schools. And essentially it was in this really piece of high-tech equipment, all stuff you can find at Home Depot, except for the chiller that's made down in San Diego. But all this stuff is, the containers you put your Christmas decorations in, and your shop light from Home Depot, foam insulation, this cart that you probably put the stuff on in your lab to roll around. Not anything that's really hard to get a hold of. And this is how we regrew the kelp forest. So going into the schools, teaching children how to reproduce kelp, which, lucky for us, it's pretty easy. You just stress it out and it reproduces. Um, so did a lot of that. Planted the kelp on these little pieces of tile, which of course is very permit intensive, but kelp easily grew on the tiles. We rubber banded those tiles down on the reef, and it's one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. So within a week, it would grow really slowly in the classrooms, only about to a quarter of an inch in about 4 months, because it's hard to maintain all those required trace elements. But as soon as we put it up into the ocean, in a week, we'd have 12 inches of growth. The big problem down here was urchin densities. So most of our time was spent picking up sea urchins, and it's the same problem they're having right now in Northern California. So this is the answer to the problem. You pick up the urchins, the kelp can grow back. And however, in our area in Orange County, there weren't any parents, so we really didn't have a spore source. So we had to pick up the urchins. We'd immediately see, as you see in the before picture there, a lot of fuzzy stuff on the reef, some small macroalgae growing, some smaller red algae growing. And I used to call them brown fuzzies, immediately appear. But to get the giant kelp, we needed a spore source. So we would plant these tiles around or bring in bags full of sporophylls to rain the spores down on the reef. We tried lots of different things, tying down drift kelp. Basically, if we could think of it, we tried it to get the kelp to respond. And then all the students, of course, were stewards of this project. So all the students that were required to go out in the community someplace, this is at a local aquarium, some Earth Day event or something, and put on an exhibit, show people what they were doing in their classrooms and why this project was important and how they contributed to the problem in the first place. So the kids became beacons of information. And of course, the adults were learning from the kids. So it empowered all these students to take responsibility and also ownership of the project. So I have a lot of students like Elizabeth who have come up through either going to school to study marine biology or went to study environmental science, or I'll run into them in the grocery store and they'll ask me, how's our kelp doing? Because they took ownership of the project they were part of. And that was kind of the whole point. So in 2009, this project started in 2002. In 2009, we finally saw our kelp come up onto the surface. We were all high-fiving each other and having parties and celebrations, so happy that our little babies had finally grown to the surface. We had kelp forests again. We used to do monitoring every spring and every fall, and our fish counts were now three-dimensional. Before we just counted fish in the rocks, but now we were doing somersaults, having to count all the schools of fish that were swimming through our kelp. And however, amongst all that celebration, that year we had a big south swell. And during the Labor Day of that year, 2009, the beaches in Laguna Beach looked like this. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't know this was happening, but I got a phone call on the Monday or the Tuesday after Labor Day in Laguna Beach, which was the majority of the coastline that we had restored. That's like the mecca for diving in Orange County in Southern California. All the coastline there used to be kelp forest, and it hadn't been kelp forest for 30 years. So we had done something that was inconceivable, bringing back these beautiful forests for divers and for fishes and the ecology offshore. However, we forgot to educate the people that lived in the $10 million houses on the cliffs there, because I got a phone call on Tuesday from the City Council of Laguna Beach blaming the kelp for the low business profits they made that weekend, because people didn't want to come to the beach because there was kelp on it. And I nearly fell off my chair when they said that. So I realized that we'd missed this whole demographic, and we decided to come up with Kelp Fest. Myself and a friend put together a festival that has now been going on for 8 years. It's 2018, and put on essentially by the students who I was teaching. I got them to come out and put on this festival with everything you could possibly dream up related to kelp and how to get people to love it. So we had kelp dancing and kelp songs and kelp skits, and people cooked with kelp. We had kelp mermaids, big visual. You can see a poster there in the back, big giant visual posters, and we built kelp forests. And every year was something different and creative because that's what kids do. That's why I made sure the kids were always involved. And then some beautiful artwork. So there was the Garibaldi, but every year we had a beautiful scene to make people in the town love kelp. And by the way, this was illegal because the city doesn't allow hanging anything off the trees. So in addition to all my kelp permits, of which there were 7 per year that I had to have in order to restore kelp, we got in trouble for that too. Okay, so here are some of the posters. As I said, artwork was a big deal to make people understand the beauty. You know, most people don't go underwater. So the beauty and the majesty, if you will, of the kelp forest. And what was just right offshore, we tried doing some underwater broadcasts several years in a row to show people it was just 100 yards away from where we were having this kelp fest, this beauty that they should love even when it washes up on the beach. And of course, we all know that's an important part of the ecosystem too. But they didn't understand that and they didn't like it. So that's all fixed. Everybody loves kelp now in Laguna Beach, and Kelp Fest is now a thing. People look forward to it. It's a happening. I saw last year, I was so tickled. I saw a poster and it had all the words that describe Laguna Beach on it. So if you've ever been there, it's this old lifeguard tower and it's these historical restaurants was all on this poster, and Kelp Fest was on the poster. So I was tickled to find that out. So as I mentioned, Northern California became an issue just a few years ago because of the whole sequence of events, the perfect storm that occurred, the harmful algal bloom, the sea star wasting disease, the purple urchin boom, the warm water blob, and then the El Nino. And they're calling for another El Nino this year. But all of those things created this horrible situation for the kelp up in Northern California. And in all honesty, it probably will come back eventually. But the straw that broke the camel's back for me was the fact that we're losing all of our red abalone up there. And I'm working so hard down here to help the green abalone. The red one's the only one we have left in California. So I said, this is enough. We got to do something. There we go. There's the perfect storm with the abalone shell riding it. I found that on Google Images the other day. I thought, that's perfect. I love that. So you've probably seen these pictures of the poor abalone just climbing the stalks of Pterogophora trying to get their last meal. And as of last year, they said about 30% of the stock had dwindled. Red abalone was the only abalone that the fishery was still open for up until December 2017. It's never been closed since World War II. Now that fishery is closed. Nobody can take abalone at all in California. So the restoration is underway. Like I said, I got the funds from Oceana. I actually called up Oceana and I told them this dire need, and they gave me the original $5,000 to start the project. This guy had a vacuum. He said, Nance, I got all the equipment. I just need money. So I got him the money to start the project so he could start vacuuming up purple urchins. And they've also put together lots of recreational, I think there's been 4 recreational diving events up in Northern California where divers now can take, it used to be 28 urchins a day, but now you can take 4 5-gallon buckets full of urchins a day. Which is actually a lot of purple urchins because most of them are really small. I was trying to get a recreational diver permit to do the same thing I did in Southern California, but the Department of Fish and Wildlife has put up too many roadblocks for me. They came back with 3 pages of essentially things I have to satisfy for them in order to give me a permit to allow recreational divers to take, which doesn't make any sense. So I've given up that. We're just going to do the small recreational events, and then the commercial divers, they have all the equipment anyway. They can remove thousands a day. So we'll just keep paying them. All right, so on to sea bass. Sea bass was a species that was already being raised. If you're familiar with aquaculture, it's really hard to grow species in the ocean, especially if it's not known already. You know, these complex life cycles. So I didn't want to have to figure out the life cycle of any new species. So I started looking at, once the kelp forests were restored, hey, what else can we grow? I love this model of putting them in classrooms and then taking them out in the ocean and releasing them. So sea bass is a project that was started by Hub SeaWorld Research Institute in about 22 years ago. They've been releasing sea bass. Over 2.5 million of them have been released in the ocean via their ocean pens that anglers take care of. Volunteers care for them in the harbors and marinas in Southern California, and then they release them twice a year. So I went to Hub SeaWorld and I said, I want to do this project in schools. And they said, that's awesome. We've always wanted to do that. If you have some money, you can do it. We'll give you the fish. So I actually went to Huntington Beach High School, and we wrote a grant for Toyota, who funded the first sea bass in the classroom program. And I built this in Huntington Beach High School to house the first sea bass in schools. And to my knowledge, nobody else does this in the country. There's nobody else raising fish to be released in the ocean because it's really hard. I get that. They do steelhead, and I've heard about maybe there's a shad, which is it's kind of a brackish water fish over in North Carolina, but I can't find anybody else who's doing a project like this, which I think is too bad because it allows people to get involved. So we started the program. Now there's 11 schools growing sea bass in Southern California, releasing them every year. Aren't they cute? Oh, such darlings. We're getting ready to tag ours for the year November the 26th. And we'll be releasing them the week before Christmas, before the kids go home for Christmas break. There you go. You probably recognize him. There's Huntington Beach High School kids putting their white sea bass in the tanks. These are additional 2,100 kids now have worked on sea bass projects. We've raised and released 1,100 fish. And I do this program in middle school, high school, and college. So you can actually do this for 2 years in middle school, 4 years in high school, and then 2 more years in community college, have a whole career of sea bass. And I've actually now gotten the kids jobs over at the Catalina Sea Ranch, which is the first offshore aquaculture farm in the United States, right down here off of Huntington Beach. And they're working now, having worked on white sea bass in high school, got jobs directly over there, making $60,000 a year. Woohoo! Just because they understand aquaculture. So this is a job path, and I have been dreaming of more aquaculture for the last 30 years in the United States, so we can stop importing 80% of our seafood, feed ourselves. And also, I teach a lot of diving throughout the year, research diving. And so Huntington Beach High School got to release their sea bass on one of their dive trips. The kids actually asked, well, what happens when you take them out and release them in the ocean? And Mr. Ostrowski, their environmental science teacher, said, hey, yeah, let's go do that. So we tried it. Nobody had ever gone underwater with the sea bass, even Hubs and their 2.5 million fish released. Nobody had ever recorded what they do when you take them out. So the kids had all their GoPros and we released them, and they did. My biggest fear, of course, that they were going to swim out and all get eaten by a kelp bass. But they swam out, they schooled together, they got into the kelp, and they hid, just like they're supposed to. Yay. So school taught them something. All right, green abalone. This is the last of the restoration projects. This one's going to take the rest of my life. The abalone is I'm kind of glozing past these goal projects, but essentially all these projects have a goal to educate and create ocean stewards, just like Elizabeth. So everybody who comes through hopefully goes through the project, learns something, take that away with them, and then they come out the other side also wanting to protect and conserve. So now we don't have to maybe worry about this problem ever again. That's the goal, right? And we also want to restore green abalone. That's the other goal of these projects, is do restoration. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. All right, so for those of you not familiar, there are 7 species of abalone in California. All of them are titled, including the reds now, which are in decline. They don't have an updated number on their populations, but like I said, last year, Department of Fish and Wildlife said they lost 30% of the fishery, and we have 6 others that are not doing so well either. This is what they all look like, which generally is just like a rock. Unless you have a skilled eye and have a lot of experience identifying abalone, it's nearly impossible to tell a rock or an abalone from a rock, let alone which species of abalone they are. So it's a little tricky. But for those of you who are under the age of 50, like me, there was a time in California that abalone were very plentiful. And I have a few pictures here just to give you an idea of what plentiful means, because you've heard of the concept of shifting baselines, where people will go out and start diving 2 years ago, and they come back and they say, "Oh, there's so many abalone. Yeah, there's so many of them out there." And I'll say, "I don't think you know what that means. Let me show you some photos." Well, this is a processing plant that was in San Pedro, California. I've talked to lots and lots and lots of folks about these days when abalone were plentiful. Um, a gentleman in New York City who used to have the shells shipped to him so he could make buttons out of the shells. There's an abalone processing plant in Santa Barbara. This is a tide pool in Laguna Beach, 1920. A friend's mother took this, gave it to me. These are all black abalone, which, if you remember from a few slides previous, are now an endangered species. I've been studying the tide pools, every tide pool, as a matter of fact, in Orange County for the last 2.5 years, and I have seen 2 black abalone, and I'm looking for them. So there used to be a lot of abalone, the point of all this. And I love this quote. So just take a second to read this. This is the great example that we can never say we'll never run out, right? Can't possibly fish out the abalone. Impossible. At that time, we thought it was impossible. This is a restaurant covered with 50,000 abalone shells in Hollywood, California. So there were all these shells laying around, which means that all of those were alive at one point. And let me tell you that the commercial limit for abalone for a single commercial diver per day was 1,440 abalone a day. So for that limit to be on it, that means you could possibly take more. If they had to put a limit on the number you could take, you could actually get more than 1,440 in a day. So the height of the abalone commercial industry was the 1950 to 1960. 44 million pounds were harvested. It was a multi-million-dollar industry, reaching up to $3 million. By 1994, it was collapsing. And one of my good friends here in Orange County, who sits with me on the Recreational Abalone Advisory Committee, that's a committee appointed by the Fish and Game Commissioner, he was the one that wrote the bill to shut down abalone fishing in Southern California. Everybody was very much against it, and he had a lot of death threats put on him. It was a very lucrative business, and nobody wanted to have it closed. But now it is illegal to harvest abalone in the United States for commercial sale. And the status around the world, there are 57 disputed species of abalone. It changes regularly, but all of them have some sort of status of threatened or endangered or in decline because they're a snail and they taste good. So you're doomed. So we meet the demand for abalone around the world with aquaculture. It's pretty much grown everywhere that people enjoyed it. It's pretty much farmed. This was Carlsbad Aqua Farms, no longer growing abalone. I had the great idea, of course, at the time when I started the project, that I was going to buy these abalone from this farm and also from the cultured abalone in Goleta, California. And I was going to put them in classrooms for a year for students to learn what an abalone was, because they didn't know what an abalone was. They had never lived during a time when there were abalone. And I was going to have the kids raise them for a year, and then I'd put them out in the ocean, just like I did with the kelp. However, no one had actually asked to work on abalone or do restoration for about 20 years in California. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife came under a lot of fire for not doing their job and closing down the fishery and saving the abalone. So they really didn't want to revisit that topic. And so when Nancy Caruso came along asking for a permit to restore them, they literally shut the door. And I called every single week. I sent letters. I had all my students send letters. I had volunteers calling the governor. We talked to the state representatives. They would not give me a permit to do abalone restoration. And so by the time I was granted the permit, 3 years later, and lots of tears, there were no more farms in the world growing green abalone. So, dilemma. And here's what the farms look like. By the way, this one's in Kona, Hawaii. They grow the Japanese abalone for markets. So, in amongst those 3 years, I was testing how I was going to do this project. I had students growing abalone in classrooms, seeing all the different ways that they could come up with how to kill them, power shutting off at Christmas time, forgetting to turn the valve back on after they chilled the water, hydrometers breaking and them not knowing the salinity of the tanks. So found out all those different ways that could happen. Had a tank in one of my spare bedrooms. My husband is very loving and accommodates all these crazy projects in our house. So I had abalone in the house for much of that time period. I have to tell you a quick funny story, but this particular tank on the bottom right there was in our spare bedroom. And at the time we had a business, an edible arrangements business, which you might have heard of. It was Christmas Eve. I had the abalone living in my house. We came home from 15 hours of work at Edible Arrangements. It was Christmas Eve. And I went to the back room there, and the abalone had spawned in the tank. The tank's only 40 gallons. So if you've ever taken care of animals in a tank, if they spawn, they're going to die in their own spawn. So I told my husband, I go, we got to do a water change. He's like, it's midnight on Christmas Eve. I'm not doing a water change. Oh, yes, you are. So I had him in the driveway mixing seawater in a trash can, and I'm mouth siphoning out the bedroom window into the yard, the spawned water, so that we could do a water change and save these abalone on Christmas Eve. So I married a good man is what I'm telling you. All right. So here's the students taking care of their abalone, learning about abalone anatomy, ecology, biology. I have a whole year-long program that I do with the schools that work with me so that the students really come away with a sense of stewardship and understanding. And by the time I got the permit, there weren't any abalone left, as I said. So the only abalone I could get were 69 adult greens that were the brood stock on at the Cultured Abalone Farm in Goleta. So I took the 69, and I realized, having read all the papers that had ever been written on abalone restoration around the world, is they've always used small abalone, from anywhere from a few millimeters up to maybe 6 millimeters maximum size, because they take too darn long to grow, right? Nobody's got funding to wait for a 10-year-old abalone to outplant. So I thought, well, this would be interesting. Nobody's ever had success in California restoring abalone. They've put them out, they lose them. They can't find them. They don't know if they all got eaten or if they just disappear into the reefs. Nobody's ever been able to show success. And I thought, well, these should be easier to track because they're big. So I took this problem of how we're going to track them, these giant animals. They were all at least 14 centimeters in size. And I asked the kids, by the way, if you ever want to solve a world problem, go to a 6th grade class. Ask the kids, how do you solve world peace? They'll tell you in 4 minutes. We don't listen, but they know all the answers. So the kids came up with all these ideas on how to track the abalone. And essentially, the problem here in Orange County and up and down the coast is that we've been protecting them since 1997, and yet we still don't have large reproductive populations. So something, probably reproductive isolation, is keeping that from happening. So that indicates a need for restoration. Just like the kelp project, the kelp had not returned in 30 years. So that indicates a need for restoration. There's something that's holding back the natural restoration of the species. So all these other programs and projects I talked about, they all use little tiny abalone. They're really hard to track. You can't keep track of them. Everything eats them. And survival ranges around the world were 0 to 30%. Japan has the highest survival ranges. I think it's because they eat all the predators. But they've been able to show a little bit higher survival. But nobody had done it for long term. They just go out for a few months because, again, nobody's got money for funding. And the way I do it is I work 6 jobs. So I can fund a project for a really long time without having to pay myself very much. So translocation is also an opportunity for these abalone, but they found out that green abalone don't like to be told where to live. The Department of Fish and Wildlife took green abalone and pink abalone, tried to put them together. The pinks stayed put. But the greens went back to where they were. I found that they don't like to be told where to go either. So keeping that in the back of my head, I started this project. So the question we're trying to answer is bigger, better. Am I going to get better survival if I use these 69 green abalone, the only ones left on the planet that were farm raised? And so we did it. I picked a spot off the coast, actually in Newport Beach, and they were farm raised. I had them genetically tested, and they're way off from wild abalone, but I got permission, as long as I picked them up at the end of the project, that I was allowed to put them out in the ocean. So I did the project from May 2013 to August 2014, which is a really long period of time. I used passive outplanting because, as I said, they don't like to be told where to live. So I just put them out in big crates and let them go find their own place. I used one of my kelp forest restoration sites. So there was kelp, number one, but I also knew the site like the back of my hand. I knew where every nook and cranny was because I didn't want to lose these things in deep crevices and holes. So this particular reef was also surrounded by sand. And I quote unquote knew they wouldn't get away. And then the kids came up with this idea of multiple tagging methods. And then employ rigorous monitoring. So I have lots of volunteers. I've trained over 300 people to help me out in the ocean. So we went out every 48 hours. Nobody's ever done monitoring like that, and monitored their movements. And again, I used the community, the citizen scientists. So we picked a spot off of Crystal Cove State Park. Don't tell them because it was illegal. And here was the site. I thought it was such a good idea. It's surrounded by sand. We put up these grids so that I could send a volunteer, for instance, into grid 3 on a day when there's 2-foot visibility. That's only 9 meters by 4 meters. But in that area, it take you a whole hour to look in every crack and cranny to see if there's any abalone. But there's actually a float that says number 3, where you are, and you could point out where you are, where you found abalone on a map, or draw it on a map for me after we were done. So here's the grid lines. This was on a really clear day. You could see from almost at the surface. Up in the top of the picture there, you can see my blocks with the floats and the numbers on them. There's number 6. So I had to design this for people who maybe have never gone out with me. I give them lots of instruction, and I send them out looking for abalone, and everything had to be laid out really well for them to make their way back. There's the 69 abalone. Average size was 16 centimeters. And the kids came up with that. I was asking, well, what can we use to tag these things with? And one of my students, she was in 4th grade at the time. Now she's an environmental science master's student. And she said, well, I think we should use a metal detector. And I didn't know you could use metal detectors underwater. I just kind of tapped her on the head and said, that's cute. Well, I found out you can use metal detectors underwater. So that was the first idea. I tried that out. Didn't work in the cracks and crevices. But then the kids said, well, everybody keeps telling us that plastic never goes away. So why don't you use plastic? And I thought, I like all these ideas. So all of our abalone went in with at least 3 different markers on them. Now, this could have contributed to more mortalities, so my numbers may be skewed because we had flashy items on them. But you can see we had all kinds of things, even dolphins and sparkles, and but all of them had some rudimentary tags that were always visible from any angle. So if they were head in or posterior into a hole, you could still make out a couple of the tags for positive identification. So this is a normal day on the reef in Orange County. We took these crates down there, flipped them on their side, and just let the abalone climb out. We found out if we didn't make them get out, though, that they'd like to live in the crates and then the cinder blocks. So we had to kind of cover up everything so they couldn't live in the cinder blocks because they love cinder blocks. So we had 28 divers who came out and monitored every 48 hours immediately after outplanting. We had 184 dive hours, and actually made an animated map of the abalone movements, which nobody else has anything like that either, where they moved every time we checked them. And some of them never moved from the first day of outplanting for the whole 13 months. We clean them every time we went out there because, of course, the ocean grows on over everything, so keep the tags clean. But you can see one of them there has a sparkly dolphin on it, number 57. And guess what? 40% survival, highest survival of any abalone restocking project in California history. So what did I learn from that? They need to be big. The only thing that we know that killed them was something that did this, smashed them in half. And that was number 10. It was the first one that ever got killed. I saw it, and the next day when I came out, 48 hours later, it was laying just like that on the rock where I'd seen it 2 days before. And we're still trying to figure out who or what did that. So if you have any ideas, I have blamed humans, and I have also had giant sea bass take the blame for that. So if you've got some ideas, please share that with me later. But there's some of the mystery predator pieces. And the pieces would all be laying right where the animal was sitting 2 days before. Now, there's cinder blocks all over the reef, and a human could easily do that with a cinder block. So let me know what you think. So bigger is better. 40% survival. So what does that tell us? We got a long wait for our abalone to grow up. I told you there's no more farms raising them, so I had to get a broodstock collecting permit. Go out and collect 20 males and 20 females and start from scratch. So I am paying the cultured abalone in Goleta, California to raise abalone for me, so I don't have to start my own farm. And so our goal right now is to spawn, which is what everybody should aspire to, right? So there we go. That's what that looks like. Sperm and eggs. If you can get them both to come out at the same time, then you've got a really good chance of getting baby abalone. But as I've found from not just my projects, but everybody's projects, it's really hard to get them to do that when you want them to. But I've had some success. And you can imagine, after all of this effort and work, I'm delighted when I have babies to watch them grow and develop. I just had a successful spawn in July, actually. So here we go. November 2017, I have 1-year-olds that were born, and now they're just about to turn, now they're about to turn 2-year-olds. They were born in 2016. That's a picture of them when they were 1. And I just had a successful spawn in July 2018. You can see my little babies right there in the red circle. That was in in October. I just got pictures. Look how big they are now. This was just taken November the 2nd. Some of them are almost 4 millimeters. They're getting so big so fast. So my goal is to create the largest collaborative effort to save a species in Southern California waters, engaging children and the public. My goal is to have this in classrooms again. I think it's so important to include the students because, as evidenced by Elizabeth, they're going to help us in the future. Collaborating with aquariums as well. I have 6 partner aquariums down here in Southern California because I'm going to need a lot of space to grow out all these abalone. I have them right now in 2 aquariums down here, and I put them in classrooms throughout the year for the kids to work on as well. But I need to grow them out for 10 years in order for this to be successful, in order to get that 40% survival. So I've got all these grow out facilities that I'm working with. Concordia University just signed on. They're getting their certification as Sibellid free so they can grow green abalone as well. And I hope to have 12 schools with about 300 kids every year in those schools growing the abalone. And I got to build nurseries for them all. So I'm always looking for volunteers. I'm always looking for money. I've already told Elizabeth, if you're ever down here in Southern California, call me, because I am doing now a wild abalone survey. So I'm starting in the tide pools. I'm surveying, looking for evidence of reproduction, because I don't think that the old ones are able to reproduce. They're too far apart, and or they're just too old, because we're only seeing old abalone. I can find them, but they're generally not aggregated together. And if I can find any small ones, then we know that they're still reproductive, and that there's a chance, at least from those few reproductive wild ones, for restoration to occur naturally. And I also want to know where these pockets, where they like to live. So I'm surveying the entire coast. I started in the tide pools. I started up in Newport. I've done 27 tide pool surveys so far, and I've already started doing subtidal surveys, trying to find juvenile abalone, where they like to live, where do the adults live, where are the sources, where are the sinks, what are they eating. This is what a tide pool survey looks like, looking for juvenile abalone. So if you don't mind hanging upside down in tide pools in sometimes 3 inches of water, give me a call if you're down here. We're out during the spring and the fall low tides searching. And in general, because you all are educated, please tell people this story that in a period of 100 years, we actually did deplete our resources of 7 different species of abalone through various means, and they're all different depths. And it's a really interesting story how we did that. But we can actually together bring them back. And that's a hopeful message that people like to hear. But tell them the story of the abalone, because it's a story that is repeated over and over and over again, unfortunately, in our ecosystems. But there is a happy ending to it, just like the kelp story here in Orange County. So by talking to people, it's helpful. And of course, I have lots of fun fundraisers. If you're ever down here, drop by for a 5K, Abalone 5K, or wine tasting, or painting for abalone. I have abalone apparel designed by Nancy Caruso. You can find these on my website. Abalone clothing and dresses, men's and women's. Thank you all so very much for listening to me rant on about ocean restoration, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors in restoration and conservation on your own paths.
Thanks, Nancy. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to move on to questions. If you wouldn't mind stating your name so that she can put at least a name to the question for her before you ask the question, that would be wonderful. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, Nancy. This is Vivian, and as an OC native, I admire the work you have done for Southern California. My question is related with your urchin collection. So, what do you do after collecting the sea urchins? Since a lot of purple sea urchins have small gonads and they're not really viable for commercial usage.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So that's the first place I looked when I started the project was, did anybody want them? Actually, Orange County had a lot of red urchins, which is a viable commercial species. But because they weren't eating kelp, nobody wanted to harvest them. They hadn't harvested them in over 20 years. So nobody would take them. I had my first permits were to take them offshore and dump them in deep water. And then because my permit was tied to 4 other organizations who were also doing kelp restoration in San Diego, Ventura, and LA County, they wanted to do a blanket permit for urchin relocation. And because there were commercial urchin fisheries in those other counties, they changed the permit to read that the urchins had to be dumped in similar habitats so that the commercial divers could then harvest those urchins from another kelp forest at a different time. And even though I told them we don't have any other kelp forests to dump them in, except the ones I've grown myself, and I'm certainly not putting them in there, they insisted that I had to put them in similar habitat. So I considered similar to be wet. That's what I did with the urchins. Right now, the urchins are actually being landed in Northern California. They're collected by the commercial fishermen. Then they're landed on shore because they have a commercial license. They have to land them. And at the moment, they're just being thrown away. If you're interested, there's a company right now called Urchinomics who claims to have a feed that they can take, and they have a market for purple urchins too. They can claim to take an undersized gonad urchin, feed it their feed. Within 4 weeks, they can make it commercially viable. So they're in the process of testing that on the Northern California urchins to make them a viable commercial product. I say, woohoo, because then everybody will want them. So at the moment, nothing is being done with them. I've talked to lots of people about commercial uses, anywhere from fertilizers to cat foods to hippie dip. And nobody has come up with a use for the purple urchin yet.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Hi, my name is Greg. Just as a follow-up to what you were just saying, I know that in the aquaculture industry, fish feed is a big problem. As everyone's going out to get fish oil and everything, and that's problematic. Has there been anyone looking into using the urchins as a way of processing feed for aquaculture? So maybe not growing the urchins themselves, but using the urchins to feed other animals?
To my knowledge, no. And have you ever seen the inside of a malnourished sea urchin? There's not a whole lot in there. So the effort, I'm not sure would be viable for fish meal that they use for aquaculture feeds. There's so much effort to get to it, so you'd have to throw away a lot of calcium carbonate shell and get rid of all those parts. So no, nobody's done that to my knowledge. But I'm all for it. I think it's a great idea.
Hey Nancy, I'm Sean Fitch. I wanted to ask you, where do you find your volunteer divers, and how did you get that part of the project started?
It's a whole lot of legwork. So I put out ads in all the publications the divers read. I went to every diver event. I call it the dive club circuit. I go and speak at every dive club. I go to the dive shows that they have for selling merchandise. So I just appeared every place where divers are. And I mean, even going down to the beaches on the weekends. One of my oldest and dearest volunteers, he's now 76 years old, still helps me. He's been helping me for 15 years. And he says that he read an ad that I put in California Diver magazine that said, looking for volunteers, must have own gear, enjoy diving in cold water, zero visibility, and doing strenuous work. And he said, I couldn't turn that down. So I didn't lie about anything, didn't make it glamorous. But what I found is that people are looking for purpose, which is the whole purpose, the whole story behind Get Inspired. And you get to an age, I think, a number of years that you've seasoned yourself in diving. And, whenever I go diving, it's always for work. But if you're just a recreational diver, you get bored looking at the same reef all the time. And then you start doing photography. And then once you've gotten really good at photography, you go, well, what else can I do? And so I found a lot of people were bored just with diving in the same kelp forest they've always dove in, or diving in the same reefs they've always dove in. And they saw an opportunity to do something different while doing the thing they loved.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Cool. Thank you so much, Nancy. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good luck.
If any of you
call me when you come home.
I will.
Okay, you guys, take care. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.